So, welcome to the New Century Narratives podcast. This is the very first episode, so there's going to be no fancy intro. It's just me and an old friend. So, Luke Robert Mason, what do you do? What projects are you getting into today?
So I run an organization called Virtual Futures, and Virtual Futures was originally a mid-90s cyberculture conference hosted by the University of Warwick. It was originally organized in 1994, 95, and 96 by the Center for Contemporary Philosophy. And in the mid-90s, the conference came about because they wanted to problematize this thing called cyberspace. Cyberspace had just emerged as a cultural interest, and the philosophy department was really interested in what this thing called the internet would do to human identity and human privacy. And of course, at the time, at a UK-based university institution, the internet was this thing that only the maths and stats department could access using a single server in the basement of one of the university buildings. So a lot of people assumed that this internet thing would never kick off, and this stuff that the philosophers were talking about was a problem that will never come to pass. So this was really a pioneering conference in a similar way that the US had the Macy Cybernetics conferences. Britain and Europe had the Virtual Futures conferences. And I found out about Virtual Futures through my undergraduate study. I was an undergraduate student at the University of Warwick between 2008 to 2011. And I was studying the work of a performance artist called Stellark. And Stellark is a performance artist who uses his body and manipulates his body through, let's just say, augmentations, and uses his body as a canvas. And one of Stellark's more well-known works is his Ear on the Arm project, where he has an ear surgically implanted into his arm. It was a project that took, I think, around 3 months, perhaps longer. And he took a tissue mesh of his own ear, basically a mold of his own ear, and then grew a tissue mesh around that, and then grew his stem cells around that. And over the course of those 3 months, he had his skin cut open and a small balloon placed under his skin, and self-injected himself with saline solution over the course of 3 months and stretched the skin, whilst at the same time this ear was growing in a petri dish made of his own stem cells, and he had it surgically implanted into his arm, and then vacuum packed the skin, and then had a small Bluetooth microphone surgically implanted into the ear, so he could take his phone call conversations by talking into the ear in his arm. So I was fascinated by the work of this post-human performance artist, and I got told that Stellark was at the University of Warwick in the mid-90s. I was a third-year undergraduate student completing my undergraduate dissertation, and one of the professors came up to me and went, "You do realise Stellark was here? He spoke at this thing called Virtual Futures in 1995, and as an excuse to bring back Stellark to the University of Warwick, I revived the conference in 2011 to look at what had happened over the last approximately, it was about 12, 13 years, to see what happened to the utopian cybernetic promises of the mid-90s, and why what a lot of those philosophers thought was going to happen really didn't happen.
Right. And that's a part of the motivation for this discussion, is that at the outset of the transhumanist movement, the techno-futurist, techno-progressive movement in the 70s and 80s, a lot of people thought that we would be in a very different place with technology. And it seemed to me, and of course this is former Grindhouse Wetware member sort of philosophy, that they were just content to kind of wait around for the movie of the future to play out. And correct me if I'm wrong or if you disagree with me. And so there's kind of, at least viewing as an American, viewing European futurists, is that there's kind of this skepticism that they have about where we might go in the next 30 years.
Well, Virtual Futures has always had that, really at the core of it. What we deal with is critical engagements with techno-philosophy and techno-science. we really try and elevate the critical voices in this space. Now, the problem with the future is it's always been, certainly since the turn of the 21st century, has always been something that's so hopeful and is so positive, and the future is going to be awesome. You know, that's kind of an American read on the future. In England, right. I mean, maybe it's just a British or a European mentality. Perhaps it's the sort of science fiction that, you know, we grew up with versus the sort of science fiction that has been inherited by in the US, which is kind of more space opera style stuff. And, you know, right. Black Mirror might be something that your audience know. I mean, that came from a British writer, Charlie Brooker, a British comedian, actually, which is kind of
it's a very British way of viewing technology.
Yes, to a degree, but also I think. So here's the problem with the future. So the future, especially American futurists, co-opt the future as a way in which they can use it as sales pitches. So the Silicon Valley way of selling the future is, you know, the future is going to be awesome. This app or this platform or this technology is going to create an incredible future. And what it negates is the fact that the reason why audiences are so excited about the future is sometimes it's because they realize there's something so fundamentally wrong with the present. And I think Virtual Futures and the platform we've been trying to create over the last 2 years is really about understanding what brings our audiences together, which is largely a degree of escapism. You know, we talk about the future a lot because we want to escape something so fundamentally terrible about the present, but you have to confront the socio-cultural issues in the present if you are even going to talk about the future. The problem is when people talk about the future, they often start with the technology, and then when they think about society or culture, usually that's just the bolt-on discussion of ethics that's associated with the technology. We really start with society and culture because what we've realized, and because there's 25 years of history that sort of permeates throughout virtual futures, what we've really realized is it's the same sorts of debates every 3 to 7 years. I mean, we work with there's this wonderful individual called Dr. Trudy Barber, who's the UK's leading cyber sexpert. And Trudy came back to the conference in 2011, and we've done multiple events with Trudy ever since. And what Trudy was talking about in the mid-90s with regards to cybersex and teledildonics and VR and touch, it's all of these things that we're now revisiting in this day and age because the technology has been commercialized. But there are the pioneers who are dealing with the more problematic ethical and cultural discussions back when this stuff was still seen as vaporware. And they've done the hard work. And what I'm trying to do with VF is really help people understand the history of the future, because then we stop having the same sorts of debates over and over and over again, because then the future becomes almost this cyclical thing. We end every single virtual futures with a little warning about the future, which has really become the mantra that guides our curatorial eye, and it's the future is always virtual. And some things that may seem imminent or inevitable never actually happen. Fortunately, our ability to survive the future is not predicated on our capacity for prediction, although, and in those much more rare occasions, something remarkable comes of staring the future deep in the eyes and challenging everything it seems to promise. And often when we talk about the future, we assume that the predictions that are made are inevitabilities. In actual fact, and the thing that British futurists deal with quite well is the disappointment that comes with a future that never occurs. There's a British theorist who was nascently involved with virtual futures in 1996, Mark Fisher, who wrote a book called Ghosts of My Lives, which really deals with what happens with the personal feeling of understanding that the future that you hoped or prophesized never actually occurred. The science fiction author Warren Ellis, who's a friend of Virtual Futures, he wrote this incredible book called Normals, which is about a mental home in the UK where in Britain, where recovering futurists go to deal with the fact that their future visions never emerged. And I suppose the closest equivalent you have in the US is the essay written on behalf of Peter Thiel's founder fund, which was we wanted flying cars, and what we got was 140 characters, which is a freely available essay online, which really summarizes what happens when the future gets co-opted by other sorts of agencies.
Well, and oh man, there's so much good stuff in there. I think that the disappointment with our narrative of the future and the fact that we haven't stepped into the role that we thought we would, I think in Scotland and in America created the biohackers movement, created the grinders, because we looked around and we saw that in the vein of human augmentation, nothing was happening, and that in fact, in order to build the future, you have to actually get up off your ass and do something. And I suppose in older futurists, and I've noticed this with a couple of I don't want to say leading thinkers, but notable, at least in my mind, there's kind of been this this disappointment, this resignation of the world isn't Technicolor. It's not this vibrant, beautiful future that we thought we were going to get. And at least what I'm trying to do is shake that off and say, okay, what can actually be done? What moves can actually be made other than hanging out on Facebook science fiction forums?
I mean, look, you mentioned the biohacker community. I've been massively supportive from afar of the biohacker community, because I think what they're doing is really similar to Stellark's work. Stellark's work is a performative promise. His Ear on the Arm project is kind of projecting an aesthetics of the future. I mean, this ear is really impractical. Stellark has described how it's a painful prosthesis to have. The microphone that he had surgically implanted into it was highly inefficient back when he had it done, and I know next year he's looking to reimplant microelectronics to allow him to put that microphone back into the ear. But what's interesting about Stellark's work, the work of Grindhouse, where and other grinders such as Dangerous Things and Mao's work with Dangerous Things, is the fact that they are so willing to take a pro-actionary approach to emerging technology that they're willing to use their body as both canvas and as laboratory. And they should be applauded for doing it. I've always said that, you know, it's those sorts of pioneers who learn often through mistakes, who allow us to actually innovate in this space. Because here's the thing with transhumanist futures that Professor Steve Fuller at the University of Warwick has raised this point very well. But a lot of the traditional transhumanists who were working in transhumanism in the 80s seem to forget is that if they want a lot of these technologies that they are espousing, blood will be spilt. Professor Steve Fuller has said, look, you know, you're essentially arguing and advocating for high-risk forms of experimentation. You know, you're expecting that people are going to be taking these drugs and trialing them on themselves to live forever, or to strengthen their bone muscle, their bone density, or strengthen their muscles. You know, these are very problematic, very highly experimental technologies. Eventually, you're going to have to test them on humans, and the sorts of humans you'll be testing them on won't be the, you know, Silicon Valley elites who are paying to develop these technologies. It will be individuals of perhaps lower economic status who are, like medical trials are done in the US, are doing it for certain exchange in financial benefit. Now, Steve's raised an interesting point as a potential way in which we might be able to trial these sorts of hyper-experimental transhumanist technologies in the future. Is what we should have is something similar to conscription. So in the 1930s, 1940s in Britain, there were these posters with "Your country needs you. You need to sign up for Queen and country and go to war." And going to war and dying for your country was seen as a very heroic thing to do.
Mm-hmm.
And you had swathes of men who were either conscripted into the army or who signed up willingly to basically go to war for Queen and country, to be remembered, and they were fighting for something. Now, Steve kind of argues that maybe we need something similar with regards to medical trials. So if you are of 21 and of sound mind, you can sign up to a highly experimental form of drug experimentation, which may hyperextend your life, or it might kill you. But if it killed you, you died in service of the future of humanity, and you should be celebrated as a pioneer and as a hero for doing so.
And I just want to clarify something. So you mentioned both conscription and sign up. Just for the people that are listening, is what this professor is suggesting, is this voluntary, or is this like a draft?
Well, initially it would be voluntary, and I think Steve was pushing it even further, and Professor Steve Fuller is the person you should probably ask about this, but perhaps pushing it even further to a draft. But in the first instance, it should be voluntary. Look, if there's people who want to use their own bodies to experiment and have let's say it's a 50-50 chance of extending their life, then why shouldn't they be allowed to sign themselves over to medical science, and why shouldn't society celebrate them as the heroes and pioneers that they are? Now, we see that to a degree with the biohacking community already, and the nascent joke is, all you need to do to be a biohacker is to have a scalpel and a bottle of vodka, and, away you go. Now, the thing I like about the biohacking community, especially in the US and especially with dangerous things, is they are doing a very, very good job at communicating their findings. Now, it might not be in a medical setting, it might not be in a lab setting, unlike the work of Professor Kevin Warwick at I think he's currently at the University of Coventry and previously Reading, where he was doing these in academic settings and having to pre-write the ethical forms and having to do the feedback because it was required of him as a professor. But the biohack community do have these forums where they go, look, this is biosafe material. I tried this and it did this to my hand, and oh, by the way, if you're of a certain muscle density in your hand, you probably don't want to have a chip here, and this is how you staple the chip if it and to stop it from traveling through your body. So there is this kind of feedback loop between the individuals who are doing this stuff, aren't doing it in situ by themselves individually. They are communicating back the research to the greater community to allow the community to proceed with less risk. And it's kind of self-policing. And why should we stop individuals doing that? Now, in the US, there is a question, and in the UK as well, of what happens if that self-modification happens to go wrong. And this is where there's a difference between Europe or the UK and the US. Now, in the US, if you surgically implant something under your skin and it happens to travel, you'd have to go to a doctor's surgery to have it removed. And I assume at least it would be something that you'd have to pay for personally,
terribly fucking expensive.
It's terribly fucking expensive. Whereas in the UK, we have this thing called the NHS. Now, if you look at breast augmentation, where often women have certain parts of their body augmented for aesthetic reasons, there's been cases in the UK where an individual will go and they will have their breasts augmented, and they will pay for that privately and do that through a private Harley Street surgeon or similar. And then something will go wrong. One of the breasts may deflate or explode, and they're able to have that removed under NHS, under UK taxpayer money. Now there's a
which makes biohacking incredibly, well, I wouldn't say incredibly safe, but much safer in a place where people actually care for each other.
Well, it's much safer, but it also creates a lot of issues whereby the general public are going, look, why are we spending NHS money on people who are deliberately doing risky things to their body? Why should we? Why don't we just give this person a Darwin Award because their hand turned gangrenous because they surgically placed a whole bunch of non-biosafe material under their skin with light up rigs and batteries and God knows what else? Why the hell shouldn't we just let them have their hand fall off? Why is the UK taxpayer paying to have that removed? And that becomes a contentious issue. So there is that massive difference between the UK and the US when it comes to biohacking. And look, we need those sorts of protections. If we learn something about placing the whatever it is under the skin or augmenting the body or biohacking the body from that individual, and it happens to go wrong, and we help that individual from a medical perspective afterwards, then should we chastise that individual for taking massive risks, or should we celebrate that individual for taking massive risks and learning something? And it's
so
still very hard to get the general public to have that change of consciousness.
What's interesting here is that it seems like the solution is a cultural one. It seems like the real work is getting people to accept that some people want to take these risks. Because I think without that, we will continue to get really good medical technology, but the scope of intentional human augmentation won't be as vast as what the technology allows for. And I think we're in that scenario today where most of the money going into technology is going into developing apps. And don't get me wrong, applications and software solutions have real effects on people's lives, but no one wants to touch intentional human augmentation if it's not medical. And that seems more of a cultural problem than a technical issue.
Well, we're potentially about to see that change. So there's projects such as Elon Musk's, largely it's Vaporware, but Elon Musk's Neuralink and Brian Johnson's Kernel. Now, we don't actually know what these technologies are going to look like, but speculatively, what they've been described as is neuroprosthesis, or essentially interventions into the human brain. And from what has been described by both of those individuals, it sounds like it's going to be invasive. It won't be a degree of neurostimulation where you wear something that puts a small electrical current through the brain. It's going to be something that's going to be placed onto the actual brain organ. Now, the wonderful thing about the brain is you can perform surgery on the brain without anesthesia, because the brain doesn't actually feel pain. But the issue is going to be, it's like, who's going to sign up to actually be the first person to have this sort of intervention done to them? Now,
well, I think many people will. I think.
Well, I can see how it's currently being done, which is with projects such as Brain Gate. We're using people who are traditionally considered as disabled and using them as the first movers. So Nigel Ackland is a UK-based user of the UK's most advanced prosthetic limb, the B-Bionic. And Nigel Ackland raises a really good point. When he sees paraplegic individuals who've gone through a traumatic incident in their life suddenly have a hole cut in their brain so they can have chips placed into their brains so they can control a prosthetic arm over the internet, Nigel raises an interesting point that is, look, this person has already been through a lot of trauma. Their body's been through a lot of trauma. Why should we force them to now have holes cut in their skull so that we can add more technology and more inconvenience to their life. And that kind of raises an interesting point. I mean, these individuals are doing it, are volunteering their bodies to engage in these sorts of experiments because they see it as a possibility of returning to, for want of a better word, a degree of normality where they can have control over external limbs. The question is, if we're going to create these technologies, shouldn't the people who build them be the first people who use them? I mean, wouldn't it be so interesting to see, the CEO of a company go, look, we've developed this in-house and I believe in it so much that we're not going to test it on, traditionally what we consider to be disabled individuals who we're going to return to a degree of normal. We're going to test it on myself, an able-bodied individual, to actually see if it does enhance or augment my body. And we've seen that to some degree with what's happening with BioViva and Liz Parrish, where arguably she's undergoing this, I'm not entirely sure of the entire medical process, but she's undergoing a degree of self medication, whereby she's allowing herself to be the first tester of this commercial form of human augmentation, the hope of BioViva being that they will be able to extend healthy life. So we're about to see that crossover point. The question is, will the commercial entities who are developing these radical forms of intervention turn towards the body hacking community and go, would you like to be our guinea pigs? And equally, will the body hacking, biohacking community turn around and go, hell no, I'm not having what is traditionally seen as a corporate entity that has a large degree of private financial interests use my body to allow them to further their commercial interests. So we're going to see this collision. The question is, how are those two worlds going to collide? And I'd be interested in asking you, Lucas. I mean, what are you seeing from having spent time with Grindhouse Wetware and the sorts of underground biohacking communities? What do you think their visceral response will be when these more, I don't want to say cleaner, but more commercial entities start rolling around, whereby they have an imperative to create a product that will be available to the public en masse? How do you think the biohack community is going to respond to that?
Well, I think there's a couple of motivating factors that lead someone to biohacking. One of it is just a love of the dark cyberpunk, Blade Runner, I can't remember the book, Snow Crash sort of world. Another is just an impatience to cross an imagined finish line. And so I think the response will be largely, I don't want a corporate entity putting anything into my body, but I think there will be a sizable amount of people that will want to sign up to be a cyborg. I count myself in that camp. I think that whatever drawbacks that there will be for me, I'm still pushing the field forward. And so even if I lose privacy, I'm still doing a net good, I think, in just being a proof of concept. A lot of biohackers and grinders do not think that way. They would rather find a way to steal the technology, replicate it, and make it buildable in a basement. I think that one of the hurdles that the biohacking community faces is the paywall. There's an upper limit to what you can do if you don't have $100,000 on hand. And so I'm really interested to see what ways that enthusiasts and biohackers and transhumanists can get involved with these large these large corporate projects. I think that's where we're going to see a lot of really interesting stuff happen. And I think that's going to be the next project of the transhumanist community, is figuring out how we can make use of this enthusiasm. Because right now, everyone's just kind of waiting around for the next cybernetic arm or cybernetic eyes. And it seems that because technology is being pushed forward by markets, by capitalism, there's not much incentive to develop niche solutions to a desire, you can put it. So I think that relationship between the enthusiast and the wealthy individual with a corporation like Elon Musk, I think that's going to be the relationship that's going to define the next stage in cybernetics.
The only thing I worry about is when there's an influx of capital, it becomes about a singular product. And I think the productizing of biohacking is going to be potentially difficult for individuals to deal with, because it assumes that what you essentially get is an off-the-shelf singular unit. You get the Samsung of augmentation, or you get the Apple of augmentation. What I really love and think that should be celebrated more about the biohack community is what they're really doing is less about a celebration of technology and more about a celebration of difference and differentiated morphologies. So Max Moore, the transhumanist who wrote about morphological freedom back in 1989, talked about how we're going to be able to have full freedom to manipulate our body. But where Max fell down on that essay was his assumption was the sorts of interventions that we would do would lead towards a singular goal, which is to make an individual, a human individual, stronger, better, faster, more intelligent. Intelligence is always a big one, and partly, a lot of the Neuralink and the kernel stuff is really about a fear of AI, and they see neuroprosthesis as a logical response to upgrading the human brain to respond to AI. My problem with that is it assumes this entire project is about upgrading the human. I personally think this whole project should be about celebrating difference, and the best way I can explain that is understanding the difference between a cyborg-like or an individual who identifies with cyborg ways of being, which is Stellark, and comparing him to someone like Neil Harbisson, who calls himself a cyborg and has been registered, I think, on his passport as a cyborg. Now, Stellark's interventions were these third arms and third ears, and they were these extra prostheses, which were extensions of the body as the body existed. And the hard challenge was controlling these prostheses. With the third arm project, he was controlling that by triggering it with his left arm, but it was an attachment that was attached to his right arm. And there's all these functional problems that come with creating these kind of exoskeletons on the body. Now, what Neil Harbisson has done is he's done something slightly more nuanced. He's become what Dr. Andy Clark would call a profoundly embodied cyborg. So Neil Harbisson, for the listeners who don't know who he is, he's a colorblind artist who has an antenna surgically implanted into the back of his head, and the antenna allows him to hear color. And it's doing slightly more than that, actually. It's not allowing him to hear color, it's creating an entirely new sensory modality. So the camera at the end of the antenna takes light waves, an analog signal. The camera, through a digital process, converts the light waves to sound waves, and then through an analog process again, vibrates his skull. So he's not interfering with his hearing, traditional hearing through the sense organ of the ears, but it's creating vibrations through the skull, which is creating this entirely new sense. Now, what's interesting about Neil Harbisson is that he's been using this device for, I think, almost 10 years now, and Neil now dreams in sonochromatic dreams. So when he takes the device off and closes his eyes and falls asleep, he has the music play through his head, and he dreams with sonic audio. Now, he has, or at least his body, has accepted now that the antenna is no longer a tool or technology or device or externality. his body has accepted that antenna is now an organ. If you go up to Neil Harbisson and try and touch the camera on his antenna, he recoils as if I came up to you, Lucas, and tried to like weirdly just touch you on the nose. Now that's an entirely new experience with technology. That's where an individual has used the biases of neuroplasticity to rewire their brain so that their morphology accepts that they now have this entirely new sense. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the experiments in where they're taking individuals who've lost one sense and they're replacing that with another. For example, people who've lost their sight and they can do sensory substitution through tactile touch on their tongue or the bottom of their back. They're able to use touch as a seeing input, and over a period of time, and it's a period of duration, and duration is the key word, they're able to accept this as a form of sensory input into the body. Now, there is a limitation to the human body. It's a biological limitation, but we do have this amazing piece of grey gloop in our skull, which is our brain, that is able to rewire itself based on externalities of technology. The best example is people who suffer from phantom vibration syndrome. The idea that you leave the house without your phone and suddenly you feel your pocket vibrating, and then you realize, oh no, my phone isn't in my pocket, it's back at home, but my brain has accepted that my iPhone or my Samsung device is an extension of my body. So we have brains that are able to work in collaboration with technology to allow us to profoundly extend ourselves through technology. But here's the catch. It takes time. And with Neil Harbisson's work, it's all about putting analog signals into the brain, because the brain is an analog computer in so many ways. It's not a digital computer. And the sorts of promises that we're hearing from things like Kernel or Neuralink is that we're going to be able to directly interface digital technology with a biological analog organ. And I don't think that's going to be as easy as they say. And I don't think it's going to be plug and play. Individuals, consumers, are going to have to deal with the fact that they're going to put this thing in, and it's going to take, in Neil Harbisson's case, it was 10 years before he was really getting the full sensorial experience from this, and he had to wear it every single day durationally. And the device itself has been upgraded across time. And it took 10 years for the brains to sort of rewire itself. We're going to have to deal with the fact that we're not going to be able to plug something into our brain and suddenly be smarter like in the Matrix. Oh my God, I know how to fly a helicopter now. What's it that Neo says as he comes out? He goes, I know Kung Fu. It's not going to happen that way. And we need to share those concerns with the general public, because again, it's going to be a case where we're going to go, where are our neuroprostheses that we're going to make us instantly smarter? In actual fact, I don't even think it's going to be some sort of silicon-based application to the brain. I think the sorts of augmentations we're going to see are going to be biologically based augmentations. It's going to be upgrades not by putting chips on the brain, but it's going to be upgrades through some biomedical intervention. It's not going to be silicon, it's going to be silicone adaptations to the body. I think it's going to be biological instead of technological.
I'd like to go back a little bit and talk about accepting difference. If you've been on the internet for the past 2 years, you would have noticed you would have noticed that there is this wave of new conservatism, and it's pushing for this idea of a new normal. And I think that the implications for human augmentation past the initial stages of one or two companies owning such technologies is really a sort of speciation of morphology. People are going to do all sorts of interesting, crazy shit to their body. And it seems like a certain part of the culture in the West is trying to double down on some sense of normality. have you had any interface with the new conservative alt-right sorts of folks, and what do you make of that? How do you see that fitting into the story of the developing future?
I've had no direct collision with the alt-right, but so you're right. There is an identity politics problem in the US. It's less in the UK, but identity politics has become such a big thing about how people self-identify. Now, I think individuals who undergo biomedical procedures to say change gender or identify more with the gender that they see themselves as, or maybe biologically or cognitively identify with, these individuals are already dealing with these sorts of problems and discussions about how they self-identify in society. So I think we're going to see a massive subspeciation. It's not going to be along gender lines, but it's going to be on lines of ability. Do I think we could ever be in a situation whereby, a white person could genetically manipulate themselves to become a black person? Well, maybe, and vice versa. Now, the question is, what is the reason for these sorts of interventions? Now, let's go back to things like aesthetic body modification, whereby often women have certain augmentations for visions of what they perceive to be a degree of beauty. So they have their face manipulated, or their breasts augmented, or thanks to Nicki Minaj, their posteriors enlarged, because that is a cultural vision of
It's very
beauty.
cultural.
It's a cultural thing. Now, if that's the thing that's defining how you should be, then there's something dangerous there. What we should enable is a situation whereby individuals are allowed to surgically and biologically and genetically manipulate the way and express themselves in whatever way they see fit and want to express themselves. I'm fully supportive of that. I don't believe that then we should play the sorts of identity politics games that we'll begin to see in the US, whereby you demand other people to call you by certain pronouns. I'm going to be Cyborgia X, and it's like, oh Jesus, all right. So that subspecies of human is this, and this. What I think we should do is accept that humanity exists on a spectrum, and then talk about the human and allow for a range of differentiated morphologies, a range of differentiated sexual identities, a range of differentiated ability. The problem comes from a desire to find issues of difference between individuals rather than actually find what fundamentally unites individuals. And I think we're going to be in an interesting time where we learn more about the human brain and genetics. That one of two things could happen. Either our understanding, our ability to reduce human individuals to information, or reduce them to biology, or their neuro output, will do one of two things. Either it will force this idea of genetic determinism or neurodeterminism, whereby the biology you get born with defines your outcome, similar to the 1990, it's 20 years since the film actually, the 1997 film GATTACA. But as GATTACA, the film proved, genetic determinism, is biology isn't always destiny. And I think a lot of people were able to transcend biology already without the need for radical technological interventions to allow them to do that. They just do that through these very, very human things such as will and determination and focus and all the things that allow individuals who may feel like they've been given a disadvantage in life to actually exceed what would traditionally be seen as their limitations. I mean, it's a very, very difficult issue. I'm kind of for embracing differentiated human morphologies. The problem is what happens when we start demanding new forms of identity politics within that, and if we do see the human species subspeciate, will we still see a baseline of human, or will we choose to live within the communities of individuals who have the same sorts of augmentation as ourselves? I mean, the reason why humanity has survived for so long is because we are, different. The running joke that, sexual reproduction, thanks to bicycles, meant that we were able to, extend the human genome to people who weren't our cousins is the reason we have survived for so long.
Right.
You do need that. You need that spread of difference. You need people to be surrounded by differentiated ideas, by differentiated ways of being. Differences is the thing that should be celebrated here. The cyborg should be about difference. It shouldn't be about defining a new paragon for the human being and then telling everybody they should aim towards that, which is kind of what's happened with these cultural manipulations, whereby this is the current, and for whatever reason, the current aesthetic trope of beauty, and therefore all surgery seems to be driving towards that aesthetic trope. When in actual fact, people have desires for multitudes of different types of bodies and beings. Providing you're making the decision for you and not society or other individuals are informing that decision, but then that's really a negotiation with yourself, and it has to start with the sort of person you want to be from the outset.
Yeah, and I think that a part of what we're seeing is a cultural artifact of the technological limitation. And what I mean by that is sexual reassignment surgery is pretty much male to female, female to male. And in terms of plastic surgery, it's pretty basic. So I think the limitation of the technology means that there's only a certain number of groups that can be created, and that that leads to people discriminating against one particular group, and that one particular group asking for special rights. I think if we get to the point where the differentiation can be so vast that it's just too much of a hassle to put people in categories, I think that will be the end of identity politics, because there will be too many identities.
It's going to be when the aliens land. The best thing that could happen is tomorrow this alien species lands, and suddenly we'll have a cultural awakening of realizing that, everybody who was strapped to this blue marble is all in this together, and that becomes the new other. For some reason, we want to other each other. Rather than realize there's more that unites us than divides us. There's so many cultural and political issues right now that you get into some very, very difficult territory when you start talking about being able to allow individuals to make certain decisions as the social economic group that they want to genetically identify with, look like or identify with, and would it go full circle? Individuals who are born white with arguable white privilege would genetically manipulate their offspring to not have a degree of privilege because it's seen as a thing that allows them to engage in certain identity politics conversations. I mean, it could go all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. What we're talking about right now is vaporware. This hasn't occurred. We haven't seen massive subspeciation. We haven't seen this sort of fracturing of communities around genetic or intellectual ability. I mean, you could argue to some degree that may have occurred. Individuals sort of associate with each other.
Yeah, people are making that argument with the fact that the economy has become so brain-based. Programmers making $80,000 a year starting salary.
Well, look, this is the problem I have with the folks who are arguing for intelligence augmentation. See intelligence as the only important resource that we as human beings produce. No one ever talks about creativity augmentation or empathy augmentation. Everybody talks about intelligence augmentation, and of course, when you're the let's just say something like the Future of Humanity Institute, which is an Oxford-based institution that's interested in to a degree human augmentation and transhumanism, and you are professors who realize that their economic standing in society and their exchange out into the world is intellectual property. They produce, intellectual papers, and they get reimbursed for that by having an academic career. And there's some sort of selection bias there. The people who talk about intelligence augmentation are often intellectuals talking about intelligence augmentation. To them, intelligence is the thing that creates their, workflow. You don't have artists talking about creativity augmentation, and empaths talking about empathy augmentation. Why has it always got to be about this singular thing, intelligence? Why can't we accept that we'll allow the artificial entities, the AIs, to do the intelligence thing for us? We'll offload the intelligence problem to the AIs because we have this limitation of the body. What we'll do as human beings is more creativity, please, more art, please. We'll allow the AIs to solve the maths problems. Why do we have to run that stuff through our brains? We're going to have a non-human agency that will do that, and we can do what humans do very well, which is creativity.
Yeah, there's definitely a singular narrative, a singular talking point when it comes to how we are going to change ourselves. It always seems to be in one direction, and I think a lot of that is cultural. I've been really interested to see what discussions other cultures are having around this idea of human augmentation and the potential cyborg. The Japanese relationship with technology I find is really interesting, and it's something that I'm gonna make a video essay about later, about how Shintoism informs the Japanese relationship with technology and kind of personifying their machines. And I'm really interested to see how that plays out across cultures.
Well, all of this comes back down to a fundamental understanding of, even though technology arguably, and we still don't know if it's actually working this way, but even though technology is arguably working through Moore's law, culture doesn't. Mm-hmm. As we get cultural progression, as we get technological progression, we don't necessarily get cultural progression. I've heard this best described by the this science fiction novelist Douglas Copeland, who talks about this fictional drug called 9-tenicillin. And 9-tenicillin is a drug fictional drug you take that makes you think 9/11 never happened. And what he means by that is, in the US, it's been 15 years since 9/11, and in the US, on CNN, they play, as far as I understand it, they play verbatim the news footage from 9/11 2001 back on TV. And the only thing you notice is odd about that footage is two things. One, it's shot in 4:3, not 16:9, so it's a square image. And two, the other weird thing is the fact that everybody kind of looks like they do in New York 2017. Clothing-wise, there's not been a massive difference, or culturally there hasn't been a massive difference between 2001 and 2017. Now, there was 15 years between the Beatles and punk, and aesthetics changed massively in those 15 years. The fashion changed massively in those 15 years. The music changed massively in those 15 years. Between 2001 and 2017, there might have been technological speed up, but there's been cultural slowdown. In other words, everybody's wearing kind of retro clothing, and vintage is big, and everything sounds like Coldplay or Adele now. And Taylor Swift's new song is referential to some 80s tunes, and
there's a lot of synthwave.
The rise of synthwave, and you look at music cultures and fashion cultures, and what you're seeing is this kind of cultural stagnation, almost this drive towards retromania. You look at that footage from 2001. The thing that you realize very viscerally is the one thing that all those individuals on the ground aren't doing is holding their electronic devices to the sky. The massive difference is the fact that, if a terrorist incident at that scale happened today, the thing that everybody would do before running would be to take their phone out of their pocket, switch on Facebook Live, and stream the tragedy. And that's the only thing you notice. No one's walking around with iPhones. No one has a camera on the street. It was the last singularly mediated incident. And since then, we've never seen something of that scale, whereby the mediation isn't done by CNN, where we all have this kind of the theorist Philip Auslander talks about it to a degree, where we have this kind of collective memory of it. And that collective memory is based on, I think it's 8 different angles of the planes going into the buildings. And we all kind of share that memory. In the large extremes, you've got individuals in the US who've claimed they were in the building or claimed they were on the street, and it turns out later on they weren't. But they have this kind of weird affiliation and association with this massive traumatic incident. And we all have this weird association with this massive traumatic incident because it was something that was so heavily mediated and heavily fed back on loop. There was no mediation from the ground, from individuals. This was pre-Twitter and pre-Facebook and pre-iPhone and pre-cameras being in every single iPhone and pre-4G internet. I wonder if anything like that happened today, how the narrative on the ground would actually change. So, long story short, really what I'm talking about is this thing that Douglas Copeland is recognizing, which is culture is stagnating to a large degree. As we joke at Virtual Futures, we see the same arguments every 3 to 7 years. For some reason, it always falls on odd years. But the discussions around VR are very similar to the discussions everybody was having in the mid-90s about VR. We haven't really progressed the cultural discussion around these technologies. We're still obsessed with these science fiction narratives that we thought we were going to get. And, they're basically talking about, Douglas Copeland, the science fiction author, realized that even though technology may be speeding up and we suddenly have all these small smart computing devices, what we don't have is cultural progression. The aesthetics are very much the same. The arguments and the fears around these technologies are very much the same.
Yeah, that is quite true, and I think I've reached the point where I'm kind of tired of hearing the same fears, the same arguments when it comes to human augmentation in particular. Back from when I was reading about Kevin Warwick's work as a cyborg hopeful, to when I started working with Grindhouse Wetware to now, it hasn't really shifted. The cultural, the zeitgeist hasn't really moved forward, and I find that interesting. I think I've become less interested in the specific technology and more interested in the culture. My last question, or my last 2 questions. One, what is your personal vision for the future?
I always get this question. Maybe it's because of Virtual Futures. A lot of people ask me, what's your personal idealized vision? And I've learned one thing, that prediction is a mug's game and should be avoided at all costs. Because I believe this about the future. The future is used as a point of leverage. And it's used as a point of leverage for 3 different reasons. Either it's used to leverage something personally, or politically, or for profitability. So the only reason you would ever make predictions about the future would be for one of those three things. For Kurzweil, it's very personal. He wants to bring back his dead father, so he's making these 2045 predictions, or I think 2035 now, that we're all going to be able to upload our minds into computers and take our data files and create versions of ourselves in silica. For folks like Elon Musk, who has this wonderful mimetic power of taking stuff that we've been talking about for the last 25 years and then mentioning it once in passing on a stage, and then suddenly everybody's like, oh my God, Elon said this. The example I'm using is the simulation theory, which is something which has been around for years. But Elon says it, and suddenly everybody's like, oh my God. Or Elon talks about solar, and suddenly everybody's like, Elon, oh my God, it must be happening. But the reason he's making these vast predictions are, profitability. You mimetically get the public sort of behind or excited about this possibility, and there's a profitability degree to that. I almost believe somewhere deep down that all this fear about super intelligent AI is actually profitability motive as applied to AI. I believe that the folks making this sort of stuff are nowhere near creating human-level AI. But if they walk around and tell the general public that, oh my God, only in a few years we might have human-level AI and it's going to be smarter than us, it's going to be really, really intelligent, that's really good for investors to hear that they're able to create machinic entities that are as smart as human beings. And I kind of, a little cynic in me, kind of believes that, all of that fear of AI, let's talk about the fear of AI, oh my God, AI is going to take all our jobs, is just good marketing. And then political, which really goes back to stuff that Dr. Richard Barbrook here in the UK has spoken about when he wrote his book, Imaginary Futures, but it's kind of framed in the space race of the 60s, where you had Kennedy going, look, we're not doing it because it's easy, we're doing it because it's hard, and put all this investment money behind the space race because it was politically a smart move, because at that point in time in the 50s, 60s, if you own the future, you own the present and the past. Right. And really his discussion of, a future space race, and the Americans being the future space race, was really about political sway and how to get individuals cognitively aligned with that sort of mission. So my fear is every time I hear future predictions or people espouse these kind of ideas of how they think the world is going to be, it's either for one of those reasons, a personal reason, a political reason, or a profitability reason. It's why I'm so suspicious of careerist futurists, individuals who are paid by individuals who are paid by brands to present to brands. And what always makes me hyper suspicious is there isn't a single futurist who doesn't give the summary presentation which doesn't include the brand of which they're being paid by. There's always going to be Coca-Cola in the future, and that's because that futurist was paid to give that presentation on behalf of Coca-Cola. Sugar water will always survive. In actual fact, if you're going to be honest about the future, companies like Coca-Cola, there should be attrition there. Maybe they won't be around for the next 50 years. And just because they have for the last 50 years doesn't mean that they're an invincible brand. And I always concern myself when I see folks who are paid by corporate clients espousing sorts of futures which have their corporate clients at the center of those futures.
Well, luckily you are on the right podcast, because I'm not so much interested in what you think will happen, I'm more interested in what you think we should do.
I think we should be more critical. To be honest with you, I think we should align ourselves with storytellers rather than futurists. I'm a big advocate of science fiction, and we do a series at Virtual Futures called Near Future Fictions, where we try and discover the next, well, really William Gibson or Bruce Sterling, but the sorts of science fiction that people are finding is stuff through Netflix and Netflix-style science fictions. They're finding Black Mirror. And in fact, when we were running our panel events in London, a lot of people would put their hands up and go, "Oh, this discussion really reminds me of episode 3, season 2 of Black Mirror." But look, if people have visceral responses to those sorts of narratives, and that is the best way in which you can engage the general public with the future. Because what I'm seeing is not just these 3 categories of people leveraging the future or because it's personal, profitable, or political. I also see that within those categories, there's these subcategories of the sorts of people who have these sorts of predictions for different reasons, and I kind of jokingly dismiss them. There's the no future folk, who basically one type of futurist who basically say, "Oh look, and their research is often funded by insurance companies, and they spend their entire careers warning of us of an impending Armageddon and an existential risk and the imminent arrival of super intelligent AI that would destroy humanity, and that's of course if nanotechnology or synthetic biology or an asteroid doesn't hit us first." So there's those sorts of futurists, and there's the more future madmen, who more traditionally aligned with sort of transhumanist mentalities, and these are the folks who want to live forever, either through cryogenically freezing their bodies or being uploaded into a computer or having their body parts endlessly replaced ad infinitum. And these are the loons who, write those books about 2045 predictions. Those are the more future madmen, who are selling us this kind of, we're going to be here forever, and it's going to be amazing, and it's going to be a fixed version of the human as it is in the 21st century right now, and we're going to extend that through history, which is slightly scary to me. And then lastly, there's just like the parallel people, the future people, who are the, folks like Elon Musk who are talking about simulation. And those are the people who believe that all that is happening now is happening in parallel, that we live in a simulation, and this is multiple versions of the simulation, and whatever we're getting now, the future's already been laid out. So whatever we're getting now is just a version of what could be happening on multiple different universes. And look, whatever you think of that kind of idea, what's quite interesting is that the no future folk, those folk who kind of are worried about existential risk, seem to also be strong advocates of like the parallel future people, because after all, if your industry is risk and you're worried about like us ending it all through creating super intelligent AI or some biohazard, then it kind of backs the idea of a backup.
Right.
It kind of makes you feel slightly, warm inside that, if we mess up this reality, then at least there's a parallel reality that's also running a simulation that won't mess it up and won't have the super intelligent AI and is living a better scenario, which I think is just, lazy morals and ethics. But, I find these communities of futurists so problematic, and it's why I really hate being called a futurist. I'm happy to be called a futurist. I'd never call myself a futurist. I think that word has lost a lot of cachet. I understand that there are studies in futurism across the world. There is prediction work being done by very, very legitimate organizations, but then there's a lot of careerist futurists who essentially, their model is, I'm going to call myself a futurist, and then I'm going to have a keynote speaking career, and I'm going to sell not the future, but legitimacy. And it's a singular future, which is something they espouse on behalf of their client. And what they always forget is the little clause, which is the future is plural. It's never about future, it's about futures, because there's multiple ways all of this could go. My biggest problem, and the reason for virtual futures, is I think there's less and less agency of the individual. You have the ability to engineer your own life and the way in which you want to navigate your life, but it's a very arrogant position to believe that you can force a future, or as an organization or as a business, and all these guys are obsessed with organizations and business, how they can define their future. You know what? Some organizations deserve to die. That's what really creates progress. It's evolutionary. It's evolution and cultural evolution. People need to there needs to be attrition to allow for progress. It's what Thomas Kuhn used to say when he basically said, look, for science to progress, there needs to be funerals, which is also what makes me so concerned about the folks who want to live forever. It's, if they live forever, it's the same ideas ad infinitum. And the funny thing is, the sorts of people who are espousing they want to live forever are also the people you'd want to, that you'd least want to spend eternity with. I often joke, I take 68 Bowie years, which everybody, when David Bowie died, said it was a tragedy that David Bowie died so young. But David Bowie lived 68 years of exploring multiple identities, from Ziggy Stardust to God knows who else he was creating throughout his music career. That gentleman lived an incredible 68 years on this planet. 68 years that some people would never live in 200 or 300 years. So, why don't we celebrate, death as well as longevity if you live a full and rich life. As I said, I'm doing a lot of work right now with this thing called near future fictions, and some of the works that I'm looking at are flipping these sorts of futures on their head, really. And one of them being in the near future, the average life expectancy is 204 years old. But you know what? It's actually a blessing to die at 68, because if you died at 68, it means you've lived a full life, an exciting life. And as they used to say, only the good die young. And you're one of the people who live the third of the life expectancy, and everybody living till 204 can't wait to leave this blasted planet and wish they could be living this exciting life, and instead they're living 200 years of hard graft and labor, just trying to survive fiscally and economically throughout that period of time. Everybody who dies at 68, that's seen as a real blessing and a new normal, and they're trying to stop people from killing themselves at 68. And as I said, science fiction is the place in which we can really explore futures in a safe space. And my warning to your audience and your listeners would be, then don't blame science fiction authors for when one of the futures that you happen to like don't come to pass, because some of the more problematic futures may come to pass. And that's why we've had this resurgence of Brave New World in 1984. Science fiction authors are true futurists. Storytellers are the real futurists, but they much prefer the word storyteller, because they know futurism is a mug's game.
And this is a really great segue into the last question. From my knowledge, you're not a scientist. I am definitely not a scientist. What role do non-technical people play in building and exploring possible futures without becoming keynote speaker number 75?
I've avoided keynote speaking for the last 2-3 years of my personal life, partly because I'm training myself to work on what I'm specifically focused on, which will be the crux of my future study. So I don't feel you should jump on the keynote stage if you have nothing original to say, and unfortunately there's too many people on the keynote circuit that have nothing original to say, but say it very quick and very loud and have very pretty slides, so they get away with it. And good on them. Like, it's good money, it's a good career, so continue to do so. Where I see my role specifically is public communication of science. Virtual Futures is run as a community interest company. All of the content that we produce is produced under Creative Commons with attribution, is freely available to the community. We try and film everything to high quality. We produce multi-track audio of all our discussions. And the real key is, from a curatorial perspective, how do we, as an organization, surround ourselves by differentiated voices and capture the sorts of discussions that are happening across multiple fields. So we've run discussions on everything from longevity with Aubrey de Grey, to VR with Jaron Lanier, to digital culture studies with folks like Douglas Rushkoff and Adam Greenfield in the UK, to dealing with the technocracy, to genetic perfection, to prosthetic envy. So what we're trying to do is really surround ourselves by intellectual difference. differentiated ideas and allow people to critically engage with those ideas and be open to individuals' own biases when it comes to approaching some of this arguably high-tech stuff. But the sorts of discussions we're having are never about technology, never about which product's going to win. Is it going to be the HTC Vive or is it going to be the Oculus Rift? And that's not the discussions we're interested in when it comes to things like VR. We're interested in the more human discussions of, what do these technologies do to the brain? What do they do to us viscerally as individuals? How do they make us think about empathy, and how can they be used to dissipate pain and more human-oriented discussions on technology, because all this stuff starts with the subjective individual that's at the heart of this, which happens to be a human by virtue of the fact that you and I and your listeners are all humans. Apart from the bot that's like auto-transcribing this right now, that's an AI.
Well, it's a little over an hour. I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out.
Thank you.
To talk with me, and I know you've got a busy schedule running or helping run Virtual Futures, so thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Lucas. And if anybody's interested in finding out more about Virtual Futures, we're like I said, we're UK based, and you can find out more about us online at Virtual Futures, pretty much on any piece of social media. And we're an entirely audience-funded organisation, so we're interested in collaborators and folks who want to bring interesting content and have interesting discussions. So we're entirely open to your audience reaching out to us, and I can be reached on Twitter at Luke Robert Mason.